Man insults wife on stage, Steve Harvey SDEPS, and immediately marriage is supposed to be a partnership. Two people standing side by side, lifting each other up, protecting each other in public and in private. That is what it is supposed to be. But on a Monday afternoon in June 2025, a man stood on the Family Feud stage and did the opposite. He did not just embarrass his wife. He did not just make a careless joke at her expense. He insulted her. Directly. Deliberately, in front of 200 people and cameras that were broadcasting to millions. He called her stupid. He said it with a laugh, like it was nothing, like the word carried no weight, like the woman standing next to him had not spent her entire adult life building a home and raising children and holding together a marriage that this man seemed determined to tear down one public humiliation at a time. Steve Harvey heard it, and something inside Steve Harvey snapped. Not violently. Not recklessly, with the surgical precision of a man who had made every mistake this husband was making and who had spent years paying for it. Steve stepped in, not to start a fight, to end a pattern. And what he said to this man on live television would become one of the most important statements about marriage, respect, and the way men speak to women that had ever been broadcast on American television. Before we dive into this, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. Every man needs to hear what Steve Harvey said on that stage, and every woman deserves to have it said on her behalf. The Hargrove family from Memphis, Tennessee walked onto the Family Feud stage looking like a family that had been assembled from two different puzzles. The pieces were all there, but they did not quite fit together the way they were supposed to. There was a tension in the way they stood, a stiffness in the spaces between them that suggested the matching lavender shirts they wore were doing more work than fabric should have to do to make 5 people look like a unit. The family captain was a man named Vincent Hargrove. He was 45 years old, a commercial real estate broker who had built a successful career selling properties across the Memphis metropolitan area. Vincent was the kind of man who filled a room with his voice before you noticed anything else about him. He spoke in declarations. He walked in straight lines. He shook hands like he was closing a deal, and he treated every interaction, including with his own family, like a negotiation he intended to win. Vincent had the surface charm of a man who understood that first impressions were currency, and he spent that currency generously with strangers while running a deficit with the people who knew him best. Standing next to Vincent, but not close to him, was his wife, Sharon. She was 43 years old, and she was the person holding this family together with the quiet, invisible labor that nobody noticed and nobody thanked her for. Sharon was a stay-at-home mother who had left a career as a paralegal 14 years ago when their first child was born, because Vincent had said he wanted someone at home full-time, and Sharon had agreed because she believed that was what partnership meant. She had spent the last 14 years raising 3 children, managing a household, coordinating schedules, handling finances, maintaining relationships with extended family, volunteering at the school, and performing the 1,000 daily tasks that constituted the operational infrastructure of a family but that were never listed on a resume and never came with a performance review. Sharon was smart. Not for a stay-at-home mom, smart, a qualifier she had heard more times than she could count. Smart. She had graduated in the top 10% of her class at the University of Memphis. She had worked at one of the largest law firms in Tennessee. She read voraciously, followed current events closely, and could hold a conversation on almost any subject with almost any person. But over the past 14 years, something had happened to Sharon's confidence. It had been eroded, not by a single catastrophic event, but by 1,000 small ones. 1,000 moments where her opinion was dismissed. 1,000 times her husband corrected her in front of others. 1,000 jokes that were not really jokes about her memory, her driving, her cooking, her intelligence, delivered with a smile and followed by "I am just kidding," which was the phrase that men used when they were not kidding at all and knew it. The third member of the team was Vincent's younger brother, Earl, who was 41 and worked as a warehouse supervisor. Earl was everything Vincent was not. Quiet, humble, and deeply uncomfortable with his brother's behavior. Earl loved Vincent, but loving someone did not mean approving of them, and Earl had spent years watching his brother treat Sharon in ways that made his stomach turn. He had spoken to Vincent about it once privately, 3 years earlier. Vincent had told him to mind his own business and that Sharon was fine. Sharon was always fine. That was the word Vincent used to shut down any conversation about how he treated her. She is fine, and because Sharon never contradicted him publicly, the word went unchallenged. The fourth member was Sharon's best friend, Diana, who was 42 and worked as a dental office manager. Diana was on the team because Sharon had asked her to be, and Diana had agreed because she would have followed Sharon into a burning building if Sharon asked. Diana had been Sharon's anchor for 15 years, the person Sharon called when the insults piled up and the isolation closed in and the gap between who she was and who her husband said she was became too wide to bridge alone. Diana knew everything. She knew about the comments. She knew about the corrections. She knew about the nights Sharon sat in the bathtub and cried after dinner parties where Vincent had spent the evening making her the target of his humor. Diana had been urging Sharon to address it for years. Sharon always said the same thing. "It is not that bad. He does not mean it. It is just how he is." The fifth member was the Hargroves' oldest child, their daughter Kayla, who was 14. Kayla was a freshman in high school, a straight-A student who played violin in the school orchestra and who carried herself with a maturity that no 14-year-old should have needed to develop. Kayla was quiet on the stage, standing at the end of the line with her hands clasped in front of her, and her eyes moving back and forth between her parents with the watchful alertness of a child who had learned to read the atmosphere of a room the way other children learn to read books. She knew when her father was about to make a comment. She knew the tone of voice that preceded it. She knew the way her mother's shoulders would rise slightly and then drop, the physical signature of a woman bracing for impact and then absorbing it. Kayla knew all of this because she had been studying it her entire life, and the education had cost her something that could not be measured on any report card. The Hargrove family was facing off against the Delgado family from San Antonio, Texas. The Delgados were a lovely, high-energy family who brought warmth and laughter to the stage. Both families exchanged greetings before the game started. Steve Harvey came out and worked the room with his usual charisma. When he reached Sharon, he shook her hand and asked her what she did. "I am a stay-at-home mom," Sharon said, and before Steve could respond, Vincent jumped in from his spot and said, loud enough for the microphones to catch, "She keeps the house running. Somebody has to, right?" He laughed. Sharon smiled the smile she had perfected over 14 years. Steve looked at Vincent, then at Sharon, and something registered behind his eyes. A note, a flag, the kind of thing Steve Harvey noticed that other people missed. The game started and Vincent treated it the way he treated everything else in his life, as a performance. He was loud at the podium, competitive to the point of aggression, and theatrical in his celebrations. When he got an answer right, he pointed at the audience and pumped his fist. When the family scored, he acted as though he had personally delivered every point, even when the answer had come from someone else. Earl played quietly and effectively, giving solid answers without fanfare. Diana contributed a clever response that earned genuine applause, and Kayla, when it was her turn, gave a poised, correct answer that made the audience smile at her composure. Sharon played well, very well. She gave 3 strong answers across the first 3 rounds, including a #1 response that earned the loudest applause of the game so far. After that answer, Steve said, "Mrs. Hargrove, that was the best answer we have had all day." Sharon smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and made you realize how rarely it appeared. "Thank you, Mr. Harvey," she said. And for about 4 seconds, Sharon Hargrove looked like the woman she had been before 14 years of diminishment had taught her to make herself small. Then Vincent opened his mouth. "Even a broken clock is right twice a day," he said, gesturing at Sharon with a laugh that he clearly expected the audience to share. A few people chuckled, the reflexive, uncomfortable sound that follows a joke nobody finds funny but nobody wants to be the first to reject. Sharon's real smile vanished instantly, replaced by the practiced one, the one that used the right muscles but cost something every time it was deployed. Steve Harvey's expression did not change visibly, but his energy shifted. The people who watched Family Feud regularly, the ones who had spent years studying the way Steve operated on his own stage, would have noticed a slight stillness, a fractional narrowing of the eyes, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a man who had moved from hosting mode into something else entirely. The game continued into the 4th round. The Hargroves were ahead and the energy in the studio was good. Then Steve read the question. "We surveyed 100 married women. Name something your husband does that makes you feel unappreciated." It was a straightforward question designed to produce relatable answers. Takes her for granted. Does not help around the house. Forgets important dates. Does not listen. Any of those would have been perfectly fine. It was Sharon's turn. Sharon stepped to the podium. She thought for a moment. Then she said, quietly but clearly, "Corrects me in front of other people." The board lit up. #2 answer, 27 points. The audience clapped. Steve nodded. "Good answer," he said. Then, because Steve Harvey did what Steve Harvey always did when he sensed a real answer hiding inside a game show answer, he asked a question that was not on the card. "Sharon, does that happen to you?" The studio got quieter. Sharon hesitated. She glanced at Vincent. The glance was involuntary and lasted less than a second, but it told Steve everything he needed to know. It was the glance of a woman who had been trained to check her husband's reaction before expressing herself. Steve had seen that glance before. He recognized it the way a doctor recognizes a symptom. Before Sharon could answer, Vincent jumped in again. "She is being dramatic, Steve. I correct her because she gets things wrong. Somebody has to keep her straight." He laughed. Then he added the sentence that ended everything that had come before and started everything that came after. "I married a beautiful woman. Nobody said she had to be smart, too." He said it with a grin. He delivered it with the confidence of a man who had said similar things 100 times before and who had always gotten away with it because the people around him had been too polite, too afraid, or too invested in keeping the peace to tell him what he actually was. The studio did not gasp. It went cold. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in the space between his last word and the silence that followed it. Sharon's face went blank. Not hurt. Blank. The blankness of a woman who had absorbed so many versions of that sentence that her face had stopped bothering to react. Kayla, their 14-year-old daughter, took a small step backward, as if she was physically trying to distance herself from what her father had just said. Earl closed his eyes and shook his head slowly. Diana's hand found Sharon's wrist and held it. Steve Harvey set his card down on the podium. He did it with the deliberate, unhurried precision of a man who was no longer playing a game. Steve Harvey walked out from behind his podium and moved to center stage. He did not look at the board. He did not look at the cameras. He looked at Vincent Hargrove with an expression that carried the weight of a man who had spent decades learning, the hard way, exactly what words like Vincent's did to the women who heard them. "Vincent," Steve said, and his voice was level and controlled. "I need you to hear something. I need you to hear it clearly because I am only going to say it once, and I am going to say it in front of everyone in this building and everyone who will ever watch this tape." Vincent's grin faltered. He shifted his weight. "Steve, come on, man. It was a joke. She knows I am joking. Right, Sharon?" He looked at his wife, expecting the same confirmation he always received. The nod, the smile. The "he is just being Vincent" that had allowed this pattern to continue for 14 years. Sharon did not nod. She did not smile. She stood at the podium with Diana's hand on her wrist and said nothing. And her silence was louder than anything Vincent had ever said. Steve continued. "You just stood on my stage and called the mother of your children stupid. You dressed it up as a joke. You put a bow on it with your smile. But that is what you said. You said she does not have to be smart. And I need you to understand something about that sentence, Vincent. That sentence did not land on me. It did not land on this audience. It landed on her." Steve pointed at Sharon. "And on her." Steve pointed at Kayla. "Your 14-year-old daughter just heard her father tell the world that her mother does not need to be intelligent. What do you think that teaches her about what men are allowed to say to women? What do you think that teaches her about what she should accept from a man who claims to love her?" Kayla was crying. Silently, the way she had learned to cry, with her shoulders still and her face controlled and the tears falling without any accompanying sound. The crying of a child who had perfected the art of being hurt without making noise. Steve turned to the audience. "I am going to tell you something about myself that I am not proud of. I have been the man standing where Vincent is standing. In my past marriages, I said things to women I loved that I had no right to say. I used humor as a weapon. I disguised cruelty as comedy. And I told myself the same thing Vincent just told himself. She knows I am joking. She is fine. She can take it." Steve paused. "She was not fine. She could not take it. And by the time I understood the damage I had done, those marriages were over, and the women I had hurt were spending years in therapy undoing the work I had done on their self-worth." The studio was completely still. Steve's vulnerability had changed the energy from confrontation to confession, and the audience was listening with the focused attention of people hearing something they needed to hear. "Vincent, I am not going to tear you apart on television. That would make me the same kind of person I am asking you not to be. But I am going to ask you to do something right now, something that might be the hardest thing you have ever done." Steve turned toward Sharon. "I want you to look at your wife, not at me, not at the cameras, at her, and I want you to see what I see." Vincent turned to Sharon, and for the first time on that stage, he actually looked at her. Not the automatic, reflexive glance of a man who was accustomed to her presence the way he was accustomed to the furniture in his living room. He looked at her. And what he saw, what was written on her face as clearly as the hand-lettered names on a $6 shirt, was not anger. It was not fury. It was not the explosive confrontation he might have been bracing for. It was tiredness. The deep, accumulative exhaustion of a woman who had been absorbing insults for so long that she no longer had the energy to be wounded by them. She just endured them, the way you endure weather. "Sharon," Steve said gently, "I want to ask you the question your husband never asked. How does it feel? When he says things like that in front of other people, how does it actually feel?" Sharon looked at Steve. She looked at Vincent. She looked at Kayla, whose silent tears were still falling. and then she spoke. Her voice was quiet but precise, each word selected with the care of a woman who had a paralegal's training in the weight of language and who had spent 14 years being told her words did not matter. "It feels like disappearing," Sharon said. "Every time he says something like that, I get a little smaller, not on the outside, on the inside. The part of me that used to believe I was smart, the part that graduated in the top 10% of my class, the part that worked at one of the best law firms in Tennessee, that part gets quieter every time he tells someone I am not smart enough. And the worst part is not the comment. The worst part is the laugh, because when he laughs, he is telling me that my pain is entertainment. And when other people laugh with him, they are telling me my pain is normal." The silence that followed was the loudest silence that studio had ever held. It pressed against the walls and the ceiling and the floor and every person inside them. Vincent's face had changed. The confidence was gone. The performance was gone. The salesman who walked into every room ready to close a deal was standing on a game show stage with nothing to sell and nowhere to hide. His eyes were wet. His mouth was working, but nothing was coming out. "I did not know," he said finally, and his voice was small in a way that it had probably never been before. "Sharon, I did not know it felt like that." Sharon looked at him with an expression that held 14 years of evidence to the contrary. "Yes, you did, Vincent. You knew. You just did not care enough to stop." The audience exhaled, not in shock, in recognition. The recognition of 200 people who had just heard a woman say the thing that millions of women had thought but had never been given the stage to say. Steve walked to Sharon and stood beside her. Not in front of her, beside her. "Sharon, I want you to hear something from me. You are not disappearing. You are right here. And what you just said, the courage it took to say that on this stage in front of this audience, that is not the act of a woman who is getting smaller. That is the act of a woman who has decided to take her space back." He turned to the audience. "And I want to say this directly to every woman watching who heard herself in Sharon's words. You are not small. You are not stupid. You are not a punchline. And the person who makes you feel like you are, regardless of whether they say it with a smile or a laugh or an "I am just joking," that person is wrong. They are wrong. And you deserve better." The ovation was immediate and sustained. The audience was on its feet, and the sound that filled the studio was not just applause. It was the sound of agreement, the sound of solidarity, the sound of hundreds of people saying, through their clapping and their tears, that they had needed to hear this and that they were grateful someone had finally said it. Kayla walked to her mother. The 14-year-old who had spent her life studying the dynamics of her parents' relationship, who had learned to read atmospheres and brace for impacts and cry without sound, walked to her mother and took her hand. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She stood next to Sharon and held her hand and looked at her father with an expression that said, more clearly than any words could have, "I am choosing which one of you to become. And I am choosing her." The game resumed, and the Hargrove family won. Sharon played the remaining rounds with a sharpness and confidence that had not been visible earlier in the day, as if the act of speaking her truth had unlocked something that had been sealed for 14 years. She gave 3 consecutive correct answers, including a #1 response that made Steve shake his head and say, "Mrs. Hargrove, you just reminded everyone in this building what happens when a smart woman stops holding herself back." Sharon smiled. The real smile, the one that reached her eyes. The family played fast money and won the $20,000. When the score was revealed, Sharon did not look at Vincent. She looked at Kayla. And Kayla looked back at her mother with the expression of a girl who had just watched her mother become visible for the first time. When the episode aired 7 weeks later, the clip of Steve Harvey's intervention and Sharon's response became one of the most shared pieces of content on the internet for an entire week. It was viewed over 100 million times in the first 10 days. It was covered by news outlets around the world. It was translated into over 35 languages. But the statistic that mattered most was not the view count. It was the response from women. Within days of the episode airing, women across the country began posting their own stories under a phrase that emerged organically from Sharon's words. "It feels like disappearing." Women described the moments when they had been diminished by partners, colleagues, family members, and strangers. They described the jokes that were not really jokes, the corrections that were not really corrections, the laughter that was not really laughter. They described the slow, methodical process of being made smaller by someone who was supposed to make them feel safe. The conversation was enormous, spanning every demographic, every culture, every age group. Therapists later called it one of the most significant public conversations about verbal diminishment in relationships that had ever occurred outside of a clinical setting. Sharon gave one interview after the episode aired, with a national morning show. She looked different from the woman who had stood on the Family Feud stage, not because she had changed physically, because she was sitting up straight, because her voice was steady and clear, because she was not checking anyone's reaction before she spoke. "I want to be honest about something," Sharon said. "That moment on the stage was not the beginning, it was the result. The beginning was 14 years of small cuts. No single one was bad enough to make me leave. But together, over time, they bled me dry. I stopped trusting my own mind. I stopped believing I was intelligent. I stopped speaking in groups because I was afraid of being corrected. I became the version of myself that my husband's comments created, and I thought that version was the real me. It was not," Sharon continued. "Steve Harvey did not save me that day. Let me be very clear about that. I saved myself. I opened my mouth and I said the truth. Steve gave me the stage, and I am grateful for that. But the words were mine. The courage was mine, and the decision about what happens next is mine." When the interviewer asked what happened next, Sharon said, "We are in counseling. Vincent is doing the work. I am not going to sit here and tell you everything is fixed, because it is not. 14 years of damage does not heal in 7 weeks. But for the first time, he is listening, not correcting, listening, and that is a start." Vincent did not give public interviews, but Sharon confirmed that his behavior had changed significantly since the taping. She said the most important shift had come not from the public confrontation, but from a conversation they had with Kayla 2 days after returning from Atlanta. Kayla had sat her parents down at the kitchen table, a reversal of the usual dynamic that neither parent had expected, and had told them, in the clear, precise language of a teenager who had been rehearsing the speech for years, what it had been like to grow up watching her father diminish her mother. She told them about the time she overheard a boy at school make a joke about a girl's intelligence, and all the other boys laughed, and she had felt sick because it sounded exactly like her father. She told them about the time a friend asked her why her dad was so mean to her mom, and she had not known how to answer because she had never heard it described that way before. And she told them that she had started to believe that what her father said about her mother might be true, that maybe her mother really was not smart, and that it was not until the Family Feud episode that she realized her mother was one of the smartest people she had ever known, and that her father's comments had been a lie she had almost believed. That conversation, Sharon said, was the moment that broke Vincent open. Not Steve Harvey's speech, not the public humiliation, his daughter's words. The realization that his 14-year-old child had internalized his behavior and had nearly begun to replicate the belief system that sustained it. That his daughter had almost learned to accept that women were not smart, that she had almost learned it from him. Sharon said Vincent cried for an hour after that conversation, and that it was the first time in their marriage she had ever seen him cry. Earl, Vincent's brother, gave one interview and he said something that resonated with millions of men who watched the episode. "I knew what my brother was doing to Sharon. I knew for years. And I said something once and he shut me down and I let it go. I told myself it was not my place. I told myself their marriage was their business. And I was wrong, because when you see someone being hurt and you stay silent to keep the peace, you are not keeping the peace. You are keeping the pain." Steve Harvey did what I should have done years ago. He opened his mouth. Diana, Sharon's best friend, was quoted in a magazine article about the episode. She said, "I spent 15 years being the person Sharon called after dinner parties. I was the cleanup crew. I would listen to her cry and tell her she deserved better, and then she would go back and it would happen again. After the Family Feud episode, something shifted. Sharon stopped calling me to vent. She started calling me to plan." That is the difference between a woman who is surviving and a woman who is rebuilding. Sharon is rebuilding. Steve Harvey referenced the Hargrove episode in interviews for years. He called it one of the most personally difficult moments of his career, not because of the confrontation with Vincent, but because of how clearly he saw himself in Vincent's behavior. "I stood on that stage and looked at a man who was doing exactly what I did in my 20s and 30s, Steve said. Using his wife as material, treating her intelligence as a joke, telling himself she was fine because she never pushed back. And I wanted to grab that man by the shoulders and say, 'I am you in 20 years, and I am telling you that the bill comes due.' Every word you say lands somewhere, and the place it lands is your wife's sense of self. And when you destroy that, you do not just lose your marriage. You lose the person who loved you enough to stay while you were destroying her." 1 year after the episode aired, the Hargrove family returned for a follow-up segment. They walked onto the stage, and the difference was visible from the first step. Vincent was not at the front of the line. Sharon was. She walked out first, and Vincent walked beside her, not in front, not behind, beside. Kayla was between them, and for the first time on that stage, she was not watching her parents with the hypervigilance of a child monitoring a threat. She was holding both of their hands. Steve asked Sharon how the past year had been. Sharon said, hard, honest, necessary. I spent 14 years getting smaller. You do not get back to full size in 12 months, but I am taller today than I was a year ago, and every day I stand a little straighter. Steve asked Vincent if he had anything to say. Vincent stood on the stage, and the man who spoke in declarations and walked in straight lines and treated every room like a deal to be closed, that man was gone. In his place was someone quieter, someone who chose his words with the kind of care that suggested he had learned, the hard way, that words had consequences he could not negotiate away. I want to say something to Sharon, and I want to say it here because this is where I should have said it a year ago. He turned to his wife. You are the smartest person I know. You have always been the smartest person I know. And I spent 14 years pretending you were not, because if I admitted how smart you were, I would have had to admit how much of this family's success belonged to you and not to me. That was my insecurity, not your deficiency, and I am sorry. I will be sorry for the rest of my life, but I will also be better for the rest of my life, because our daughter is watching. And I want her to see a man who treats the woman he loves like she is the most brilliant person in every room, because she is. Sharon did not cry. She nodded. A single, deliberate nod that carried 14 years of pain and 1 year of rebuilding, and the careful, hard-earned beginning of something that might, with enough work and enough honesty and enough time, become the partnership she had always deserved. Kayla squeezed both of her parents' hands, and the audience rose to their feet, and Steve Harvey stood on his stage and watched a family that was doing the work not perfectly, not completely, but honestly, and he said the only thing that needed to be said. That is what growth looks like. Not perfect, not finished, just better than yesterday, and willing to try again tomorrow. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another one. Leave a comment below and think about how the words you say to the people you love land on them. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they are not disappearing. Because Sharon was right. The worst part is not the insult. The worst part is the laugh. And it is time we stopped laughing. We will see you in the next one.